Well, good afternoon, and welcome to this is the first event of the anniversary weekend for Christchurch. We've been in the town for 30 years, and I'm very pleased to, it's quite loud and echoey, I don't know. Very pleased to introduce Justin Brearley, the famous, the one and only, we're gonna talk through some of these topics, discussing really the evidence for theism. Justin, I've known Justin for, I don't know, 4 years, 5 years?
Yeah, at least, maybe longer.
He used to host the podcast on Premiere called Unbelievable.
That's right.
Which was really a global thing. And now you've got this new project. Just tell us a little bit about the podcast you're running now.
Well, just to very briefly introduce myself, as you say, I've been hosting time is a documentary podcast that's telling that story in real time. So those are a few of the things I'm
Has anybody here listened to this podcast, The Surprising Rebirth, Belief in God? So a few have.
I'm impressed. There's a few people who have come across.
I have been faithfully following it. I do recommend it. It's really, I think, really well done. It's slick. It's put together. The production values are good.
And I just want to thank your organisation, Genexis, as well, for partnering with us in it as well, Paul, because it's been tremendous to be able to get it out to a wider audience with your help.
Yeah. So now, the premise, the tagline is how new atheism grew old. It's a catchy little tagline, is it? How new atheism grew old and secular thinking is considering Christianity again.
That's right. Yeah.
And you've got this metaphor that runs right the way through about the sea of faith. Just tell us a little bit about that.
So, about 150 years ago, there was a Victorian poet called Matthew Arnold, and he wrote this well-known poem called Dover Beach, and it has this particular stanza in it that talks about the sea of faith, and how while the sea of faith was once at Earth's shore and sort of circled the whole globe, now it's kind of receding, and he talks about the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of this sea of faith. And that kind of has stood as an image of the way in which faith was going out, even in his generation, being replaced by science and secularism and so on. And 150 years on from that, you could say that's only increased. You know, we live in a very post-Christian culture. We live in a culture where people kind of assume that science has explained everything. We don't need God any longer. And so a lot of people think the sea of faith is just going out and kind of will never return. But interestingly, I had a conversation about 3 years ago now with an interesting sort of secular intellectual called Douglas Murray. I don't know if we've got a picture of him.
Have we got the PowerPoint running?
That's all right. We'll get some pictures in due course.
We'll get pictures in due course.
But Douglas Murray is an interesting person. He's the associate editor of The Spectator magazine, and he's a sort of an interesting conservative sort of cultural thinker, and he had a faith at one time, but it kind of petered out basically in his late teens, early 20s, and he was very much part of this new atheist movement, which we'll perhaps describe in a bit more detail in a moment. But when he came on the show to kind of talk about his views on faith, he referenced this sea of faith and the fact people talk about the sea of faith going out, and he said, well, the thing about the sea of faith, Justin, is that it could come back in again. And he talked about the fact that actually he was surprised to see among his peers and friends a number of people who were quite surprisingly converting to Christianity, thinking, rational, 21st century people who had decided that actually Christianity made sense. And even Douglas Murray himself, even though he's not a believer, he calls himself a Christian atheist. And that sounds like a contradiction in terms, doesn't it? But what he had realized really in the last few years was that actually everything he really valued about life, all his beliefs in dignity, human progress, equality, human rights, all of that came not from his atheism, and it didn't come from science. it came from Christianity. He had suddenly realized actually that so much of what he believed really boiled down to what Christianity tells us about ourselves. And so Douglas Murray kind of inspired me to write this book, basically, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, because I was seeing similar things happening among people surprisingly converting to Christianity. And I just felt that that sea of faith might be starting to come back in again, that we might be starting to see the turning of the tide, because as we'll talk about, I think the new atheist thing, it was a big deal about 20 years ago, but it has kind of spectacularly collapsed.
Well, let's go back to that, because that's the starting point of the podcast. And I don't know if people here remember the buses, the adverts on the buses. God doesn't exist. Go and have a good time. Enjoy yourself. This was a real thing, wasn't it? A strong movement sort of 15 years ago.
It was 2009, the Atheist Bus Campaign. And again, this was a movement that had these buses going around London with the slogan, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." And this was, the closest thing to an advertising campaign that atheism had had. But there were similar things happening in the US. You had this Reason Rally in 2012, which saw tens of thousands of people descend on the Mall in Washington to kind of champion science and reason and to chant against religion. And the new atheism really as a movement was kind of this high point in kind of anti-religious dogma, really. Lots of high-profile scientists and thinkers with TV programs, best-selling books, who were basically telling you God is a delusion and religion is bad for you. That was the sort of the two main points they were making.
And you talk in the podcast about the four horsemen.
Yes.
Just explain that expression.
So there were these four key characters. Again, I don't know if we've got any pictures available, but
they should be with us soon.
No worries. But there were four key people who kind of were the leaders of this new atheist movement. Richard Dawkins, a well-known UK biologist, and he wrote a best-selling book called The God Delusion, sold probably over 2 million copies, I think. Christopher Hitchens, a journalist. He had another best-selling book called God Is Not Great. Sam Harris, a US sort of public intellectual with another best-selling anti-God book. And Daniel Dennett, a philosopher who also kind of wrote against religion. And so these were the sort of four heads of the movement. Now, two of them have actually passed away. Christopher Hitchens in 2011 from cancer, and only a couple of weeks ago, Daniel Dennett died as well. But these were very much, if you like, the figureheads. They were seen as these sort of pillars of intelligence, and they were scientists and philosophers and public intellectuals, and they very much were frequently in the papers, online, big guests at these atheist conferences around the world.
And you interviewed some of them at least.
Did,
on Unbelievable and
yeah, absolutely. So I got to interview Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins, and in a way the conversations I was hosting on Unbelievable, whether it was with them specifically or with people who were very like them, were very much reflecting this debate going on at the time. So it was quite a sort of exciting time to be starting a debate show on these issues, because it was very much in the public square, this question of, can we believe in God? Is religion good for us? Because you had these best-selling authors, you had this movement going on, and so I really enjoyed being in the midst of that, bringing on some of these quite bombastic new atheist-type characters opposite Christian thinkers to debate these ideas. And that kind of, I'd say, sort of was, pretty much typified the show from about 2005 to about the sort of the mid-2010s. But then I did start to see a change in the atmosphere.
And atheist churches as well.
Yeah, that was a thing. That was a thing. So there was a kind of a move towards people wanting still some of the trappings of religion, some of the kind of community and the kind of things you get, the inspiration and that sort of thing that you might get from coming to a church service. So there was a well-known example of this. The Sunday Assembly began again in sort of the late 2000s, which was essentially two stand-up comedians who had the idea of, well, for people who don't believe in Christianity but still want something like church, let's create a kind of godless church, basically. And so you had, it was quite popular for a while, people coming together on a Sunday morning to kind of sing more like pop songs rather than
they did.
than hymns, a kind of inspirational message rather than a sermon, a kind of maybe a reflection on love instead of prayers. And it was an interesting moment because it showed that people still wanted the benefits, if you like, of religion, but they didn't so much want the supernatural beliefs.
Yeah. So that was, I remember all of this, and it was very popular, particularly with young professionals and the like. What went wrong, and because there's been a turn, hasn't there?
I think there really has. So I was kind of watching with interest from the sidelines at a lot of what was going on with the new atheist movement, and it was very popular for a good time. But then there was an event that I can almost pinpoint actually to, I think it was 2011, when there was an atheist conference going on in Dublin in Ireland, and one of the speakers at this conference was a young atheist vlogger called Rebecca Watson, who went online as Skepchick.
Is this Elevator Gate?
This is Elevator Gate, yeah.
Okay,
Any controversial thing has to have the name Gate at the end of it, doesn't it? But Elevator Gate at this atheist conference. And what happened was Rebecca Watson had been speaking on her videos for some time about the problem of misogyny and sexism in the atheist movement. She was unhappy about the fact it was essentially led by these 4 white guys, and she also had been running constantly into a lot of sexism and patriarchy, as she saw it, in the movement itself. And so she delivered a kind of seminar at this conference on why she thinks the atheist movement needs reforming, okay, to be more feminist in its approach. So anyway, there were late night drinks that night at the bar, and as she was returning to her hotel room, she went into the elevator at about 2 a.m, and someone who was at the conference basically propositioned her and said, "I really enjoyed your talk. Do you want to come back to mine for a coffee?" sort of thing. And we all know what that stands for. Anyway, she kind of vlogged about this in the following days and said, "This is exactly the problem, everyone. I've just done this talk, and then here you are making me uncomfortable in an elevator, objectifying me, you know." Anyway, that might have been the end of it, except that one of the people who was at the conference decided to write a response to this, and that person was Richard Dawkins, the best-known atheist in the world, and he wrote a highly sarcastic response to Rebecca Watson's blog titled "Dear Muslima," in which he compared her problems to a Muslim woman, say, in a very restrictive...
It was basically, here's the world's smallest violin sort of
exactly.
line, wasn't
it? Was a
it?
kind of like, what are you complaining about compared to the things other people put up with? But anyway, this just poured petrol on the whole situation, and everyone was suddenly talking about this. And I'd say this moment, Elevator Gate, kind of was the point at which I saw the atheist movement split between people who were kind of on Rebecca Watson's side and said, we need to kind of reform this movement. We need to be not just atheists, but atheists who are for something. So you had the Atheism Plus movement begin. And this was atheism plus a commitment to feminism and LGBT, social justice and so on. And on the other hand, you had the Richard Dawkins and his crowd who were like, no, that's all just politically correct stuff. We need to just be about science and reason and common sense.
Pure atheism.
Pure atheism.
So there's full fat atheism. It's got all this other stuff, the bolt-ons.
Yeah. So this was fascinating. I was watching the sidelines, but this just intensified, and they started having almighty rows online and in person. Atheist conferences got cancelled because the people who were leading this movement couldn't even stand to be on a stage next to each other. Richard Dawkins continued to pile on lots of controversy over lots of issues. Had his own Humanist of the Year award rescinded by the American Humanist Association.
Is that right?
In 2021, specifically because of his views on transgender. So he's very much taken a view that scientifically, you cannot say that men can become women or vice versa.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people who have a lot of sympathy for that position that he holds. But because it's so politically incorrect in certain circles, it means that he has been stripped of these, and is persona non grata in places where he was once seen as a kind of hero of secularism and atheism. So it's interesting to see the way the whole movement kind of internally collapsed. Because once they'd basically agreed God doesn't exist and religion's bad for you, they basically couldn't agree on anything else. They couldn't build a positive ethic for what life should look like. All they could agree on was the negative ethic. But once they tried to actually start doing anything positive, it kind of all collapsed around their ears.
And there's also, I've seen, and you say this in the podcast, and it comes through, that when it started out, it was quite vicious in relation to Christians, Christianity, sarcastic. There's a soundbite on your podcast where Richard Dawkins is encouraging people to mock and ridicule
that's right.
Christians, and that has all but gone now, hasn't it? There's a much softer approach, more respectful.
Yeah, absolutely. And the new atheism was very much typified by this very derogatory way of dealing with it. So if you ever saw like a stand-up routine by Ricky Gervais, for instance, that was very typical of their kind of approach to religion, just kind of mocking and deriding the Bible and faith. But that has changed significantly. I think partly it's just that, you know, it in our culture, it's not very edgy these days to make fun of faith. It's like, well, come on, you know, it doesn't take much to do that. And so I think to some extent it's not seen actually as that funny, the material. But at the same time, I think there's been a huge change actually in the way people are willing to think about faith. And that's kind of one of the key issue I get onto really in the book and the podcast is the way in which that new atheist movement, part of the reason I think it failed was not just this internal collapse, but it was because it didn't actually answer people's existential questions. It didn't answer their questions about why are we here? What is life actually about? It offered them science and reason. And science and reason are great for some things, but they won't tell you how to live a meaningful life. You know, it can show you how to build an aeroplane. It can, you know, get you to the moon. But it won't show you what the point of doing that is, why we're here, what we're here for. And so I think what we've seen in our culture developing is a kind of what I would call a meaning crisis, where people we know more than we've ever known. We've got more access to technology than we've ever had. We're more materially affluent than we ever have been at any time in history. And yet, we're more depressed. Young people are suffering a mental health crisis. The more sort of technology we put into our lives, the more it kind of messes us up, it would appear. And I think what a lot of people realized is that atheism didn't hold any answers to any of that. And so people have started, I think, to open up again to the possibility that there might be some wisdom in this funny old book called the Bible, and that actually there might be some sense in the kind of Christian story and the way it's shaped people's lives. And so I started to see a real difference, as I say, a turning of the tide in the way people now treat religion.
And I remember there's one YouTuber, atheist YouTuber, now I've forgotten his name, you'll have to remind me, but some of these hardcore atheists who were online mocking Christianity have themselves softened.
Yeah, absolutely.
Remind me of his name.
So you're probably thinking of Alex O'Connor, who goes online sometimes as Cosmic Skeptic. Yes. I got to know Alex several years ago now. I'd done a video kind of on an issue called the fine-tuning of the universe for life, and we might even see it a bit later. But he'd done a kind of video response, very much kind of taking the mickey out of it, and he was kind of modelling himself. He was only about 16 at the time, after these sort of, new atheist types. Christopher Hitchens was basically his hero. And it was so interesting because I did a friendly response, even brought him on my Unbelievable show to discuss the issues. And it was so interesting to see his evolution from this kind of very sort of teenage new atheist type to actually someone who was far more open to Christianity than you would ever expect. Now, he hasn't gone all the way yet, but he just grew up, in all honesty. And he's even now published videos on his channel, and he has a channel with nearly 1 million subscribers. But he's published videos now saying, I was wrong back then about the videos I made, because he actually went and did a theology degree at Oxford University. He was so interested in the subject. And he realized a lot of the criticisms he made of Christianity early on were just a caricature. They weren't. And I think he's a good example of the way that this kind of very brash new atheism has kind of faded off, and people are actually just open to taking Christianity more seriously today.
And one of the things you say, you go so far as to say we've got a lot to be grateful to the new atheists for. Just explain what that's all about.
In some ways, as I said, the new atheism was a gift to me in my show because it gave a really obvious debate point. You know, does God exist? These were the kind of questions that were being asked. And in a way, because it put the question so starkly, it was kind of easier to kind of engage with the new atheism than just someone who's not bothered either way, just a complete agnostic. So I was kind of grateful for the fact that they put the challenge out there in the public square. Now, I think the church, sadly, was often not prepared to meet that well. I think very often the church has an amazing intellectual history, the church. Some amazing thinkers, going back centuries or just to last century, C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton and people. But very often we've kind of forgotten our theology and apologetics, and we've sort of focused more on a kind of an emotional sense in which now there's nothing wrong with the emotions and the sort of that spiritual encounter with God, but at the same time I think the new atheism forced us to pick up our theology and apologetics books again and say, okay, we need to provide some actual answers. And so I think actually, in a funny way, the new atheism, when it came on the scene, really reinvigorated a robust intellectual defense of the Christian faith. And I see organizations that have popped up in the last several years have become really influential in helping to make the case. So I would count things like William Lane Craig's organization, Reasonable Faith, Bishop Robert Barron with Word on Fire. These are ministries that are really exist because they needed to respond to the new atheism. And I've seen countless people who have benefited from being given a reason to believe, a kind of really good intellectual case for faith. That doesn't mean that we only go with the intellect. Obviously, it has to be an issue of the heart as well. But I've been grateful to Richard Dawkins in that sense for actually creating an environment where Christians could start to think again. And I even know people who actually have been converted to Christianity because they came across Richard Dawkins, ironically.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing. I think one of your most effective interviews was where you caught Richard Dawkins, was it in Oxford? I think he was between venues, and you
That's
somehow
right.
got him to speak to you. I bet he regrets that. And you put to him this point about morality, and you said, well, morality on your worldview is a random thing.
Shall I read to you the exact?
Yeah,
because I've got it here. I've got it here.
Do, because it's devastating.
It's in my first book, Unbelievable Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian. And yeah, the context for this was that he'd just had a public debate at Oxford University with John Lennox, who's a well-known Christian thinker and scientist. And I managed to get a quick interview in the after-show party with Richard Dawkins. And we talked about various issues they'd debated, but the one that really stuck with me was what he said about morality. Because the question is, can you really believe in right and wrong, in moral truth, if you don't believe there's a God, if you believe we're ultimately all just, a product of the blind laws of nature and matter in motion? So this is exactly how our conversation went, verbatim. I said to him, Richard, if we'd evolved into a society where rape was considered fine, would that mean that rape is fine? And he said, I don't want to answer that question. It's enough for me to say that we live in a society where it's not considered fine. We live in a society where selfishness, failure to pay your debts, failure to reciprocate favors is regarded askance. That is the society in which we live. I'm very glad, that's a value judgment, glad that I live in such a society. And I responded, but when you make a value judgment, don't you yourself immediately step outside of this evolutionary process and say the reason this is good is that it's good, and you don't have any way to stand on that statement? And he responded, well, my value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past. I said, well, therefore, it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution. He said, you could say that. In any case, nothing about it makes it more probable that there's anything supernatural. And I said, okay, but ultimately, your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact we've evolved 5 fingers rather than 6. And he said, you could say that, yes. And that was a really important moment, because what Richard Dawkins was admitting there is that his belief that rape is wrong is arbitrary if it's just a result of evolution, okay? There have been other places in the world and other cultures where rape has not been considered wrong. It's just the way things turned out. And if that's all that morality is, just the way things happen to have evolved in a given time and place, then morality is fairly arbitrary. And you can't say that this person's right or wrong. And the problem is that most of us feel instinctively, no, that can't be right. That can't be the correct account of morality. It really does matter how you treat other people. Some things like rape really are right or wrong. there are better and worse ways of treating people. And I think what that conversation just highlights is that actually it's very difficult to understand where this sense of right and wrong, the way we should treat other human beings, comes from outside of the view that we actually find from the first page of the Bible, which is that we're made in the image of God. It's very hard to get an account of it if we are just a product of a purposeless process of evolution.
And we'll come back to that later. So what we're going to do, this is, we're going to do the session over 4 sessions. And the first one, as we've just done, is an introduction effectively to the rise and fall of new atheism. But before we move on to look at some of the evidence-based reasons for believing in a creator God, I just thought I'd ask if there are any questions arising from what we've discussed so far.
I think there is a general openness, and I think some of the surveys, especially among young people, suggest that there's a kind of just a general openness to spirituality. But I do think it is being manifest, interestingly, in Christian ways quite significantly, and we'll perhaps come on to some of the detail of that in another session shortly, because I think what a lot of people are realizing, and it's being pointed out by interesting figures like the historian Tom Holland, is that a lot of our basic assumptions in our culture are still essentially Christian in nature. And I think it's as we see some of those assumptions being challenged, especially by from other places like Putin's Russia or China or fundamentalist Islam, people are realizing, oh, there's other options on the table here, other ways of living life, and they're suddenly it's being highlighted to them that the Christian story is actually the one that probably fits best with the way they actually think about life, because they've been shaped by it already. So I think there is a really interesting number of examples of people who are seriously reconsidering Christianity, having it at one time kind of dismissed it.
Anybody else? James?
Yeah. I think there is a danger of that, and perhaps when we come to talk in a bit more detail about some of these characters that are kind of, I've noticed, talking in far more sympathetic terms about Christianity, I think you're right. A lot of them do actually kind of come from a more conservative perspective, and that's perhaps not surprising at one level, because to some extent a conservative by nature, it wants to conserve the past. They're interested in the things of the past that kind of create for a stable present. And you can see why they might be looking at the Christian story as an example of doing that. However, I do think the movement as a whole transcends that, because I think there's a kind of spiritual hunger that's actually being manifest, whatever people's kind of political leanings might be. It's just that I think some of the most visible examples of the public intellectuals talking about this do happen to sit more on the right of the spectrum, if you like. But I'll talk about that in a bit more detail later on. Yeah. Mm. Just repeat what your insight was from Newbig in terms of his reflection on the Indian situation. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. I think New Begin is a great example of that, and I think you're right that him sort of spending time outside of the West and then coming back and sort of seeing it with fresh eyes, and the way that in fact the gospel needs to, yeah, re-evangelize the West is a great example of, I think, what is sort of happening and what's been going on. So where I would draw a comparison with what you've just described is that I think the the new atheists essentially sort of see themselves as the inheritors of that Enlightenment thinking. Essentially, the view that science and reason have essentially replaced superstition and religion, and those sorts of ways of thinking about reality. I think where that needs to be interrogated, though, is that so many of the people who see themselves in the stream of the Enlightenment have failed to realize that they've, as much as they sort of stand in that stream of sort of believing science, if you like, is a better, explains our existence and everything better than religion, they still carry with them all the assumptions of the religion that they claim to kind of have left behind. And the reality is the Enlightenment didn't create our belief in human rights. If anything, a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers actually gave us reasons not to believe in human rights, because they were sort of kind of flattening existence. They were saying that really we're all kind of essentially the same, and there's no particular reason why we should necessarily prefer a human over another species. So where did this kind of idea of human rights come from? And that's where you get thinkers like Tom Holland pointing out that the idea of human rights is not an Enlightenment idea. The Enlightenment itself is a product of the Christian Revolution. And the fact that we still have this idea of human rights stems directly from the Christian Revolution, the first century belief that people are made in the image of God and that can be universalized to everyone. And so I think the important thing for us is to critique what the Enlightenment perhaps did helpfully do, in terms of, there was obviously an advance in science and technology and ways of understanding the material world, but the ways in which it actually never really spoke to these other issues that are also just as important, about value and purpose and identity. And actually, I think in many ways, what we're doing now is we're kind of rediscovering exactly what Christianity has given us, in fact. And that even the Enlightenment itself was just another kind of byproduct of the Christian Revolution in that way. I don't know if this is helping with the specific idea you have of is it the idea that the gospel needs to critique the culture we have right now? I think in that sense, yes, the culture is obviously has moved on even from Leslie Newbigin's time, and we're living in a very postmodern culture of self-invention, essentially, where we kind of the kind of traditional stories are being ripped up to be replaced with a you can be whatever you want to be kind of culture. And I think where the gospel comes in to critique that is to say, actually, trying to live that way is impossible, because you were actually made for a very specific purpose. You were made with a very specific identity. And I think increasingly, as we see the fallout in our culture from people trying to live in that way, and the way it's creating the culture wars and everything else, I think this is an opportunity for Christians to speak into that and say, there is a reason that you've been created, and there is a God who made you, died for you, and wants to give you this new identity and hope. So for me, it's just as important, as you say, to kind of to be being missionaries to our own culture as much as any other.
Let's move on because we've got a lot to get through this afternoon, and let's go back to basics. Evidence for a creator. Now, one of the I don't know if this person's here, but one of the piece of feedback that we got from this event was somebody said, well, this is an entirely misconceived project, because if you've got faith, you don't need evidence. And if you need evidence, you haven't got faith. So the whole concept of seeking to reason or to defend theism or Christianity from a reason point of view, on evidence base, is this person, bless them, didn't agree with. So, I mean, what would you say to that point? Is this something we need to worry about, or do we've got faith, it's fine, who cares?
I know where that person's coming from.
I thought you were going to say I know where that person comes from.
No, I don't have an address. But I do think they've set up a false dichotomy there between faith and evidence. Because if you just read the scriptures, we're frequently given examples where in the Gospels it says these things have been told to you so that you may believe. It's saying these things happened, Jesus did these things, and that's going to be the evidence for your faith. There's never these things are never it's never an either or in Scripture, and I don't think it should be for us. So how do these two things go together? What I would say is this: is that faith is not just sort of having a kind of spiritual experience in which we just summon up enough kind of imagination to kind of believe in something. Faith in the Bible, the word that's frequently used is pistes, which could also be translated as trust. And it's about trusting in something, but we trust in things on the basis of the evidence we have for them. So, for instance, I have faith in my wife. Why? Because I'm going on the fact that everything I know about her and all of the love that we've shared gives me the evidence that she's going to be true to me, and we are, and that we, that we're in this relationship. Now, but I don't have some kind of definitive proof, but I do have enough evidence to kind of then act on that, if you like. And that's more for me what faith is about. It's acting on the evidence we have. So I think it's really important that as Christians we can say there are real facts about the world. Someone called Jesus really did live and die and rise again. And there are good evidential reasons that we can believe that. The faith is in actually living in the reality of that. It's sort of saying, because of what I know, and perhaps it's also a personal experience, that is equally just as good a piece of evidence. It's quite a personal one. But if I believe that I've encountered God in my life, it's another piece of evidence that says, actually, I can trust this, and I'm going to go and live my life in light of this. So to kind of just say it's either kind of you've got a kind of evidential proof or you've got faith is to misconceive what faith is, I think. Faith is about acting on the basis of the evidence we've been given.
Well, let's talk about some of that evidence. I mean, there's a lot of topics, and in the Genexis series we've done quite a few of these, and we're not going to do them all today, obviously. But let's just start with the universe and what that's evidence. Insofar as my perceptions are valuable, I can see it, I experience it, I live in it. In the Bible, it talks about the existence of the universe being the first piece of evidence for a God. It might be. Should we watch the video? Can we get the video up now? Let's, because you've done this video about the dice throwing.
Well, yeah. Shall I just give a quick preamble to the video?
Stop the video. Stop the video
before you start it. So yeah, I think there are some really interesting pieces of evidence that are coming to us from modern science about the nature of the universe. One particular one, which is what the video is all about, is a phenomenon called the fine-tuning of the universe for life. So there has been the new atheism, again, one of its big claims was that science has basically buried God. Now that the more we know about the universe, the less reason we have to believe in God. I think actually there's an alternative story of science, and that the evidence has actually been going in the opposite direction to that for the last 50 to 70 years. And one of these is something called the fine-tuning of the universe for life.
And this is not Christians that have come up with
Absolutely,
this.
yeah.
This is physicists, secular writers, Paul Davis, people like that.
Yeah.
And
So this is absolutely all of the evidence that I want to marshal in a way in both my books for the Christianity is not kind of just Christian thinkers kind of coming up with ideas. It's secular historians, scientists, philosophers who are kind of coming to conclusions that I think sit far better with a Christian understanding of life than with an atheist one.
So now the fine-tuning argument, Paul Davis has this, it's a book, The Mind of God, and he has this metaphor of a universe-making machine. Now just talk us through that metaphor, and then we'll watch the film.
Well, if I can, perhaps we'll talk about that one after it, because the one that I think is most relevant to what I'm describing here in terms of Paul Davis's books is he's got one called The Goldilocks Enigma. And that's very much about just how finely balanced all the elements of the universe have to be for human life to exist, basically. So this Goldilocks story is, of course, that she didn't like this porridge or that porridge. It was too hot or too cold, but the one that was just right was the one she liked. And the bed was either too small or too big, but then she found the one that was just right. And Paul Davis' point is we live in a Goldilocks universe where everything happens to be just exactly right for us to exist. And there's no obvious reason why it should have been that way. And so it leaves a huge question about why the universe is like this. So, but it's sometimes hard to get your head around the numbers, and that's what I'm trying to do in the video.
Let's watch the video, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more.
Some people say that human existence is a result of a roll of the clock. Like a gambler who stakes his life savings on the next throw, we just got lucky in the lottery of life. Some people say there's no purpose to the universe, no grand plan, no God behind it. Our numbers just came up and here we are. But I don't believe it. If I roll this dice, chances of getting a six, that's not too bad. But what are the chances of me rolling six? Get longer. It's 1 in 6 times 5, 6. That's 1 in 36. So I have to be pretty lucky to get 2 sixes. Now every time I add the chances of rolling another 6 in a row, the odds go up exponentially, and it gets even more unlikely. Now, what if I rolled this dice 70 times and every single time I got a 6? Okay, that's pretty unlikely, but it's possible, right? Well, in fact, the chances of rolling a 6 70 times in a row are around 1 in 10 to the 55. That's a 1 with 55 zeros after it. Now, just to put that in perspective, how long would I have to stand here rolling this dice, allowing about 5 seconds per roll, before hitting that lucky streak and rolling 76s in a row? Well, I had a mathematician friend work it out for me. On average, you would have to continually roll this dice for 100 trillion, 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 trillion years before your numbers come up. That's a long time. What if you applied that thinking to us? What are the odds of us being here? Now, the odds of rolling 76s in a row, 1 in 10 to the 55, as it happens, those are the same odds of something called the expansion rate of the universe being just right for the existence of us here today. From the moment of the Big Bang, when our universe began to rapidly expand, the rate of that expansion was exquisitely finely balanced. Any faster, and the universe would have expanded too rapidly to allow the formation of chemicals, atoms, stars, and galaxies. Any slower, and the universe would have collapsed back in on itself. But as it happens, the universe expanded at just the right rate to allow for life to develop in the future, for us to be here. It hit 70 rolls of the number 6 in a row, first time. And the expansion rate of the universe is just one among 30 or so other incredibly sensitively finely tuned constants and fundamental forces in the universe that must be just the way they are for the universe to be able to produce us. So let's imagine, if I went ahead and rolled this dice 70 times, and what do you know, every time it came up 6. No waiting for trillions upon trillions of years, first time. Beginner's luck? Hardly. You would assume that I must have rigged it. Maybe the dice are loaded, maybe there are 6s on every side. It can't be chance. Now let me ask you, why would we assume that this universe with us in it, which is actually way more improbable than my 70 rolls, is just a result of chance? The fact that we're here shows that someone's loaded the dice. In fact, maybe there's no dice at all. What if the evidence points to this life-permitting universe actually being the product of an intelligent mind which intended for us to be here? Now, you could come up with some speculative other theory. Maybe there's an infinite number of universes, giving you an infinite number of chances to roll the dice. Maybe. But we don't have any scientific evidence for it. So if you're hanging your hat on that possibility, then you're every bit as much committed to a faith position as the person who says God was behind it. Believing in God isn't a delusion. It's a perfectly reasonable conclusion when we look at the fingerprints on our universe. And if it's true that we aren't just the fluke result of a cosmic roll of the dice, and that we're actually here because a grand designer intended us from the very beginning, well, that's worth staking something on.
Very good. The way that Paul Davis puts it in his book is he says, well, if you had a machine that produced universes, and all of the variables that you refer to, there are 30 variables. They're like dials on the machine.
Yeah.
And the point he makes, and this is not again a Christian writing, they all have to be exactly right to get a universe that will produce life.
That's right.
And it's such a wild improbability that at least it demands an explanation, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And Fred Hoyle, I think you've got a quote.
Yeah.
Might have it up.
Fred Hoyle was one of the first people in the 1950s to discover this fine-tuning, specifically with something called the resonance level of carbon. And he, again, was an atheist physicist. But this was the thing that most kind of brought him to the edge of thinking there might be something out there, because this had to be so finely balanced for it to be possible, basically for carbon-based life to exist, for you and I to exist, and yet it hit that perfect. The dial had been tweaked to exactly the right number in that way that he said it looks for all the world like a super intellect has monkeyed with science and physics, and there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. So he didn't become a Christian, but he certainly was very shaken by the fact. And generally, this is just an accepted phenomenon. This is not particularly controversial. The fine-tuning of the universe with the exact numbers needed for life to be possible is a fact. Now, the question is, what interpretation do we give to that? Is it evidence of a mind, of a God? Is there some other explanation for it? And those are the kinds of things.
Well, an atheist won't say it's just lucky chance. An atheist will say, as you say on the video, that we're not in the only universe.
So that's the main contender. Yeah. So this is sometimes called the multiverse hypothesis. If our universe is just one of a potentially infinite number of universes, and all just have very slightly different variations of these fundamental numbers and qualities, then maybe we're just one of the very, very unusual ones which have just the right numbers for life, and all the others are just sterile universes full of black holes or whatever. Now, that's a theory. As I sort of say in the video, I don't think it's a particularly scientific theory because it's highly contested. If it's anything, multiverse theory is a kind of projection of a certain way of looking at physics. But lots of people say it's not really science because even if they existed, they'd be completely inaccessible to us. We could never, ever test for them being there in the first place. Therefore, if something's completely untestable, a lot of people say, well, it just isn't science. It's a hope, really.
Well, there are three things about it. Number one is that the point you make that the reason for the multiverse, the only evidence for the multiverse, is you start with the premise there isn't a God. So the conclusion that you want to get to becomes your premise. And so you say, look at this wildly improbable evidence we have. Can't be chance. Now, I'm assuming there is no God. Therefore, there must be more than one. That's the first thing. But I mean, it's slightly back to front, isn't it? You're sort of cheating there, in my view. You're positing something as a solution for the evidence that is pointing the other way.
Yeah, and the reality is there are other reasons why. Actually, I think there are good reasons to believe the multiverse theory isn't a good solution anyway. This is getting slightly technical, but if, for instance, one of the issues is that if there were this vast ensemble of other universes, it would be far, far, far more likely that what we would be witnessing is a tiny patch of order in an otherwise very disordered universe. So the chances of you just popping into existence as a brain, basically, that can observe the universe around you and then popping out of existence again, that's magnitudes of order more likely than the actual universe we find ourselves in, that which is all of us here in a vast ordered universe. And the point being, if that probabilistically we shouldn't be finding ourselves in this universe, we should be observing one of those other universes because they're just far more likely to appear on average. So it's kind of a philosophical point, but it seems to strike quite a hard point against the idea that there probably is a multiverse or not.
The other one that Paul Davies, and again, Paul Davies not a Christian, pointed out to me is that even if there is an infinite number of something, doesn't mean that there's every possible permutation of that thing. And the example he gives is that there are an infinite number of odd numbers. 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. You can go on forever. You'll never run out of odd numbers. But not a single one of them is an even number. Which raises this, again, a philosophical problem, that the laws of physics, we just simply have no explanation as to where they come from. We just don't know why the laws are the laws. I mean, it's a different point to the fine-tuning. So how do we know that even if there's an infinite number of universes, there will be a sufficient open variety of these things to even that to give rise to
again, it's all very speculative. That's the problem with multiverse theories. It's incredibly speculative, and it's why a lot of scientists don't even give it the time of day. I mean, the big thing anyway, and again, Paul Davies makes this point, is that it only knocks the problem one step back because you still have to have a multiverse generating mechanism. And as lots of physicists have said, that the kind of the way in which that's been proposed itself has to have a massive amount of fine tuning for it to be able to produce this multiverse. And it just leaves the whole question open, where did that come from? You know, if you're going to knock it back there still needs to be a cause of ultimate reality, even if it's this multiverse. So there's all kinds of issues with it. I mean, the question you've raised is another fascinating one, because this is just, I mean, the fine-tuning is just one of several fascinating areas in which I think we're seeing the evidence for a mind behind the universe.
We'd better move on to because this is only one, and we'll do the next two quite quickly, and then we'll have a break because people will need a break. But human value and morality, we mentioned it briefly, but just how does that argument work?
So this kind of takes us from looking outside of ourselves at the universe and asking, is there a God, to actually looking within ourselves. And it takes us back to that conversation I talked about with Richard Dawkins particularly, because it's this question of how do we make sense of this idea we have that humans are special, that there are right and wrong ways of treating each other. This idea we have enshrined in laws like, you know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that there are specific ways we should treat each other. And I think it's very difficult to come up with an answer to that on an atheistic worldview. And I want to make it clear, perhaps this is something I should have spelled out earlier on, but most of the time, when we're asked by a skeptic or someone who doesn't share our faith, give me evidence for your faith, it's almost impossible to give a kind of bulletproof, completely flawless logical argument that will convince them. Okay. All I can do is say, I think there are various pieces of evidence that fit better with my view than with your view. Now, they may never have even looked at their own view. If they're an atheist, they may never have asked the question, well, does the evidence actually support mine? But I think that's what we've got to ask people to do, is to say, let's compare and contrast. Atheism is the view that all that exists is matter in motion and the laws of nature, and that's sufficient for everything we see in the universe and we feel ourselves as humans, okay? That everything can be explained by that. The other view is that there is a God behind the universe, and that God has been made known in person in Jesus Christ, and that's Christianity, okay? Very, very loosely. And the question is not sort of, can I give you a bulletproof argument? It's, let's just look at these two views and say which one fits best with the maximum range of data, if you like. And this is one of those areas where I think the Christian story fits better than the atheist story of reality. And it's this idea we have that we believe in human rights, in human value. Where does that come from? If it's just, as I said in that conversation with Richard Dawkins, a kind of byproduct of an unguided process of evolution, it's very difficult to make sense of why we really believe some things really are right and wrong, okay? Because it could have turned out differently, okay? 200 years ago, there were lots of people who believed it was perfectly fine to buy and sell slaves, okay? Now today, we would say they were wrong. We're not just saying they just had a different point of view, okay, because they lived in the culture they lived in. We're saying, no, they got something wrong about reality, about what it means to be human. And if that's true, it means you believe that morality is what we call objective. There's a real right and wrong about morality. It's not subjective. If you're an atheist, I think you have to believe that morality is subjective. It just varies depending on time and place and culture. There's no right or wrong about it, just what people happen to kind of believe in the majority.
Well, there isn't right. An intellectually honest atheist will accept this. There is no such thing as right and wrong. All you have is popular opinion. That's all you have.
Absolutely. But the problem is that none of us think about morality like that.
No.
If someone comes up and steals your wallet, you don't just think, oh, they've just got a different version of morality to me. You suddenly, right and wrong becomes very, if someone does something even worse, like, rapes your daughter, you know very specifically that there's a real right and wrong in the world, that morality is not just some kind of whatever you happen to believe thing. The only way you can explain that deep sense that there is a real right and wrong about the way we shouldn't treat people, that human rights really do exist, they're not just a kind of invention, is if there's a God who actually put his image in us and who has determined the laws of right and wrong, of morality. This was the argument that actually brought C.S. Lewis to faith, in fact. So C.S. Lewis, was an atheist into his early 30s, but he increasingly came to see that he could not make sense. One of the things he said is, I couldn't critique God for being unjust and unfair without having some idea of what unjust or unfair is. And he says, if I lived in a universe where that concept didn't even make sense, then I had no argument against God. And he realized actually he lived in a universe where he had to believe in right and wrong. He had to believe in justice. Nothing made sense without those ideas. And he realized my atheism cannot support that kind of a view. So it was this argument that there really is a realm of moral values and duties that led him to believe there must be a moral lawgiver behind it.
And he's not alone. Francis Collins,
Yeah.
who was the head of the Human Genome Project, he was an atheist and as a medical student came to faith through that exact route.
Absolutely.
The Mere Christianity book by C.S. Lewis and this whole thing about
and it happens,
morality.
very recently in 2012, I know of a young atheist blogger called Leah Libresco, who got converted for exactly the same reason. She is a mathematician by background, and she said she realized, just as she recognizes there's a realm of mathematics independent of her, that 2 + 2 = 4, whether or not I exist or not. It's just a reality stitched in. She came to also realize there's this moral reality. And unlike mathematics, which is just kind of an abstract thing, this is a realm of reality that impacts me, where I have to respond to it. And again, she lost her atheism on the basis of that, because she realized it couldn't sustain it, and she became a Christian. So these sound like quite philosophical kind of ideas, and they are at one level. But I think actually a lot of people, somewhere underneath, it's it's just the sense that the universe doesn't make sense on this purely atheistic version of reality that often tips them over into thinking, well, maybe there's a God. And I've seen it in so many people's stories, not necessarily all philosophically worked out in that way, but where they've just got the intuition that there's more to life than atoms and electrons, that there's something about being human that requires a God.
And just before we break, the human purpose argument, just explain that.
Well, again, this is this sense that all of us have a kind of innate belief that there must be more to life than just being born, earning a wage and dying, that we're made for something more. There's a sense in which God and a kind of transcendent purpose has been manifest in every time, place, and culture. Now, it's often had different names and things attached to it, but what seems to me to be the common denominator is that people really believe there's more to life than just this life, okay? And where does that come from? Is it, again, just a trick that evolution has played on us? Or could it be speaking into something that's true and that has an answer? And C.S. Lewis has this famous argument called the argument from desire, where he says, a duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. Humans want to have sex. Well, there is such a thing as sex. And he says, so if I find in myself a desire which no other thing in this world can satisfy, the only answer is that I was made for another world. He's saying, since we experience this desire for more, for transcendence, is it possible that there is actually an answer to it, just as there is for every other longing and desire? And he said, I think there is. And for me, the answer has been made known in Jesus Christ, because the psychologists will tell you that there are two things you need for a flourishing life. You need love and you need hope. And if you have a deficit of either of those, you can't live life. And what Christianity offers to people in abundance is both those things. Love, because the God of the whole universe came to be with us in person and gave his life, sacrificed himself to be with us so that we could know him again. And hope, because he rose again on the other side of that crucifixion and offers us this eternal purpose and meaning to say, this is not the end, actually. You were created for something far bigger. And for me, that's what we're all looking for, love and hope. And Christianity is the one worldview which I think offers that in abundance. Atheism certainly doesn't do it. On atheism, it's a very different story of reality in which your life comes, goes, and is ultimately meaningless, because all of this will be gone and forgotten in a trillion years' time in the heat death of the universe. Nothing's going to survive. But the Christian story says no. That deep sense that life is about more than just physical life is true, and it's been answered in Jesus Christ. So for me, it's a really important thing to say purpose is the place at which most people kind of have that very instinctive sense that there's got to be more.
Okay, with that, we'll take a break. I'm sure there'll be those who want a comfort break, and we'll come back at 3:15. So it's 3:05 now. We'll take a 10-minute break.
Great.
There's going to be tea and coffee available outside, and do come back in 10 minutes. Well, welcome back. Do come back in, and we'll move on to our third session. We've got a mini book stand at the back, Justin. 2 books.
Yeah,
Do you want to just briefly tell us what
both
they
the
are?
books I've mentioned. Unbelievable is sort of my case for faith. This was written at about the 10-year mark of hosting conversations between Christians and
I
atheists.
think we might have. Have we given some of those out to people?
Maybe you have.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, well,
so
that's
you
fine.
might sign some of those.
Yeah,
at the end
absolutely. If you've already got one, I'd be love to sign it for you. The new one is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, which we're about to talk about in a bit more detail. But if you haven't got copies of either, be happy to sell you one at the back and sign it for you as well.
Yeah, and they're great gifts.
Absolutely, yes. Thinking ahead for Christmas already.
So we're going to do a short session now on some of these new secular thinkers that are tapping into Christian ideas and values. And tell us first about probably the biggest name in this department, maybe the biggest name, Jordan Peterson. Tell us about the Jordan Peterson phenomenon.
Yeah. Yes, there probably is a picture of Jordan Peterson somewhere on one of those slides, but I interviewed Jordan Peterson on my Unbelievable show back in 2018. This was just at the time he was really coming into public prominence. He's a Canadian psychologist, and he just started to attract huge numbers, especially of young men, to lectures on the book of Genexis, of all things. 2 or 3 hour lectures. Yeah, thousands of young men turning up. And this is the most bizarre thing you could think of, because the audience he was attracting is essentially the same audience that was turning out for the new atheists, only a decade or so earlier. And yet here he was talking about how we need to derive our meaning, our purpose, our identity from the story of Scripture. Now, the interesting thing is Jordan Peterson isn't a Christian. He's a secular psychologist, but he's come to the view that actually we're absolutely shaped, in the West at least, by the Christian story. And he has very much kind of been at loggerheads with these new atheist types, saying, look, we need to give people hope. We need to give them meaning. That's what they're lacking in their lives. Science and reason aren't going to do it by themselves. And so he's been pointing people back towards the Christian story as a source of meaning and purpose and identity. Now, he's a somewhat, as you mentioned earlier, sort of controversial character. He's quite conservative in a lot of his social views. He gets into a lot of spats on Twitter. But he does, nevertheless, in his lectures and in his YouTube and podcast stuff, I find a lot of nuance there as well, and a real sort of deep sense of taking people's questions seriously. So I was at the O2 Arena in London in November for a talk he gave and a panel thing he did with my 19-year-old son, and there were about 13,000 people there to listen to him. It's extraordinary. And he seems to be tapping into a kind of existential itch, especially among young people who are looking for meaning and purpose and identity, who are really confused by our current culture. And he's saying to them, there is this story that can help to make sense of things. And so he's just a fascinating individual. And while he himself is hard to pin down on the God question, when I asked him, the upfront question when I interviewed him, do you actually believe in God? He said, well, it depends what you mean by God. He's a bit slippery on that one. Nonetheless, he's been opening the door to other people. I've met many people who are now Christians, baptized Christians, because Jordan Peterson kind of gave them permission to take faith seriously again. So this is just one example where I'm seeing this turning of the tide, more and more people being willing to give Christianity a second look. And I think even Jordan Peterson is on some kind of a journey. There was one particular interview he did which really caught my attention. He came out of a long period of sickness, and he spoke with a Christian thinker called Jonathan Pajot, who he's good friends with. And he talked about the fact that as a psychologist, he kind of believes in this world of meaning and symbolism, but he's also got this other world of history and facts. And he's always struggled to put those two together. But he said, in tears at the time, he said, I think Jesus is the thing that links these two things, history and kind of meaning. And that's a very C.S. Lewis-like journey, actually.
He gets
in that
very
way.
emotional.
Yeah. He's not afraid to cry. Some people have called him the weeping prophet.
Yeah.
but I think it's a good term actually, prophet, because he's almost, for me, he's like a prophet from outside the church, helping us to see what's going on in the culture and where we might need to actually think about the kinds of questions that people are actually asking, which are no longer necessarily those new atheist type questions. It's much more about, how do I get out of bed in the morning? Give me a reason for living. And that's why so many, especially young men, have flocked to him.
We've mentioned Douglas Murray. The book I read of his, Madness of Crowds, is fantastic, and challenging a lot of this sort of woke thinking.
Well,
and like,
again, as I say, he's a sort of on the conservative, more what you might call anti-woke end of things, like Jordan Peterson. But what for me is interesting is that one of his major criticisms of kind of contemporary culture is that it's taken all the worst bits of religion, the kind of judgmental, pharisaical, heresy hunting, puritanical kind of ways of thinking about things, so that people are being cancelled left, right, and centre if they don't subscribe to the latest orthodoxy on these various issues.
Including Richard Dawkins.
Indeed, yeah. But at the same time, it's lost the best bits of faith: grace, forgiveness, the view that we're all fallen and we all need grace. And so he's a really interesting person who, again, is saying, isn't it a shame that we've lost the Christian story, because our culture is just imploding because we've forgotten how to treat each other in the way that Christianity taught us to.
And there's Tom Holland.
Yeah.
You did an event, I've listened to the event in Westminster Chapel.
That's right, yeah.
Anybody else hear that? Yeah.
So Tom Holland is not the Spider-Man actor. Tom Holland.
Oh, I thought... oh, no.
Sorry to disappoint anyone. This is the historian Tom Holland. And again, he's one of these interesting people who I think is representative of this turning of the tide. Again, he's a bit difficult to pin down on exactly where he is in terms of faith, though I think, again, he's on a journey. And but he's best known for a few things. He co-hosts a phenomenally popular podcast called The Rest Is History.
Yeah, listen to that.
And he wrote this best-selling book, Dominion, a few years ago, which really just charts the way Christianity has completely shaped our moral instincts in the West today. He likens it to being like a goldfish swimming in a goldfish bowl. He says, like a goldfish doesn't realize that they're swimming in water, we don't realize the Christian waters that we exist in, basically. How it was Christianity that gave us our belief in human rights, progress, equality, dignity, freedom. He says all of these things didn't come from science or atheism or the Enlightenment. They came specifically from Christianity. His own story, which he tells very well in that book, is one of him kind of, any faith he had growing up had kind of petered out by his teenage years. And he started, after university, this very successful career in writing popular history about the Greeks and the Romans. But the more he stood in the shoes of the Greeks and Romans, the more he realized how very alien their culture and their values were to his own. Because this was a culture where slavery was just a de facto part of the economy, absolutely accepted, where the lives of women and children were cheap, where certain people could be the sexual property of other people, where the slaughter of 1 million Gauls was a cause for great celebration by Caesar, something we would today call a genocide. And he said this was a world, he came to realize just how weird and different this world was. And why did he believe in all these things that they obviously had never thought of, like equality and dignity and compassion? He realized the thing that changed it was this person, Jesus. Yeah. This was the thing. And so he's just been reminding his secular peers, you're a very Christian atheists, everybody, he's saying, basically. All of your assumptions about the way we should live life come from Christianity. And what's interesting is I think that, again, he's opened the door to lots of people taking faith seriously again. Even as he kind of sort of teeters on the edge of becoming a Christian himself, he's sort of, I think, actually helping other people to kind of take it seriously.
Yeah, he's a very engaging man, and funny when the rest is history. When you read his writings, it sounds like a Christian speaking, the way he speaks about the Son of God, the creator of the universe, coming in and dying for us, and it amazingly powerful. And then tell us also about Louise Perry. Now, she's very interesting.
Yeah, I think we've got a picture of
person.
Louise as well. Again, she's just another example, I think, of this changing tone. So Louise Perry's story is that she was schooled essentially in the kind of liberal feminist sexual ethic of all of her peers growing up. But it was her time actually working after university in a rape crisis shelter that gave her a completely different perspective on what we call the sexual revolution, the view that, anything's up for grabs as long as there's two consenting adults involved, you can do what you like, basically. And she came to realize that actually the sexual revolution was quite good for certain types of men, but was terrible actually for women and children.
Particularly poorer women.
Yeah, absolutely. And it had kind of commodified basically the age-old thing of prostitution and that kind of thing and dressed it up in a different packaging. She went on to write a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And what was interesting about this was that almost purely from a socio-evolutionary perspective, she made the case that the sexual revolution was bad for us, and she came to surprisingly Christian conclusions about what was good for us. She realized that there was this institution that had served to kind of put guardrails on human relationships and sexuality and led to the flourishing of culture, and it was called monogamous marriage. And she kind of came to this, was quite surprised to come to the conclusion that this fuddy-duddy old morality that people had rejected in the 1960s onwards was actually, it turns out, one of the best things the world had ever been given, this idea of monogamous marriage. And she has gone on to kind of basically make the case for the fact that we should take Christianity seriously again and its sexual ethic. And that's a really countercultural thing to be saying in our day and age. So Louise Perry, again, I've had a few chances to interview her. Not only has she kind of come to this intellectual appreciation of the value of what Christianity gave us in terms of the sexual ethic, but she's also, again, one of these fascinating people kind of teetering on the edge of becoming a Christian herself because she's suddenly realized how attractive this whole way of looking at life is. And again, she's got a big audience who are listening to her.
Now, let me be slightly controversial and ask, is there a danger with an era of more wide-scale acceptability of Christianity in that it leads to a dilution of the radical element to Christianity? A bit like when Constantine is converted and Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, is the kiss of death because it loses its edge, it loses its subversive element. What about that?
I think there's absolutely a danger of that. And it was interesting at Easter, some of you may have seen it, there was this video doing the rounds of Richard Dawkins saying, I'm really glad to be a cultural Christian, even if I don't believe in Christianity. So this was, he was on LBC, and basically the interviewer said, well, what do you think of, what are your thoughts at Easter? And he says, well, actually, I don't want people to become Christians, but I'm quite glad we've got the cathedrals, and I like singing carols at Christmas, and I certainly prefer it to Islam and this sort of thing. And he says, so I'm quite happy to be a cultural Christian, and I just wanted to sort of take him and shake him and say, you're not going to have any of those nice things if people don't continue to become Christians. It's sort of, you don't get the nice effects of Christianity without actual Christians. So anyway, but the way that's related to what you said, Paul, is just that, yeah, there's an absolute danger of a kind of general appreciation of cultural Christianity. It becomes the kind of the state religion in that sense, and everyone sort of adopts it kind of nominally, enjoys the effects of it, but you run that danger of it stopping being a true conversion, and that's the problem. Even Tom Holland says the problem, in a funny way, with Christianity was it was so successful that we all believe in its fundamental view of life now. But the church stopped being the one to deliver, the meals for the homeless and the healthcare and the education, because the state took it over, because the state became so Christianized, and the church lost its radical edge in that sense. So I think the thing for us is to find out, well, how can the church be as radical looking today as it was in the first century? It was so attractive in the first century because of this incredible gift it gave to slaves and women and children. That it grew because of that. and now that we all agree that these are the ways we should treat people, the question is, well, what's different now about? And one of the things Tom Holland said, actually, he's a big advocate for what he calls keeping Christianity weird. Okay, he says don't downplay the supernatural aspect of Christianity.
Yeah.
Don't kind of give up. Don't try and water it down and make it all so palatable that it becomes kind of invisible in the culture. And I think that's the great danger, is we kind of try to make it look so sort of blend in with everything else. Actually, we'll do a far better job of attracting people to what this gospel is about if we're absolutely upfront that this is a absolutely life-transforming, supernatural, you will not be the same, it is going to challenge every aspect of your life decision. And that's the important thing of, I think it's not enough to just embrace a kind of cultural Christianity. It's got to be the real deal.
So that, I think, brings us nicely to the last segment of this afternoon session, which is all about the Bible and how the title of the episode on the podcast is "Why the Bible Refuses to Die."
That's right.
Something like that, which was, well, they're all very good, but definitely one of my favourites. And one of the things I love you talk about on is the Bronze Age wisdom, the whole thing that, because I think some of the new atheists just dismissed the Bible, a lot of ramblings of some Bronze Age
goat
peasants.
herders. Yeah, that's right.
And there's this coming back of no.
Absolutely.
Just talk us through that.
Well, again, absolutely. That was the kind of the playbook of the new atheists. What do we need the Bible for? It's all just this irrelevant nonsense from the Bronze Age. And what's fascinating is to see that, firstly, the Bible has a remarkable habit of outliving predictions of its death. Okay, so the new atheists aren't the first people to predict the death of the Bible. You go back a few hundred years, Voltaire predicted, in my day, 100 years from my day, no one will be looking upon the Bible except as a museum piece. Well, the irony of his prediction was that 100 years later, his house was being used to print Bibles, and it continues to be the best-selling book in the world, bar none. Why has it got this sticking power? I think it's because the new atheists wanted the Bible, if it was going to be at all helpful, to kind of give us, good science, equations, things like that. Then it would have been completely irrelevant to the people before the scientific revolution. The Bible, the thing about the Bible is it's got this remarkable ability to speak to every time, place, and culture, even though it was created by a very specific people group at a very specific time. But it's got this coherence across the whole thing. And it is just a non-controversial fact that it has completely informed all of our culture. Every piece of art, every book, every piece of music, at some level goes back to the Bible, because it was the foundational for all of those things. Melvin Bragg, well-known, British broadcaster, even, again, as a non-Christian, says for him, the Bible is the absolute centerpiece of culture. And he wrote a whole book on this. He's done various interviews about the way he's absolutely livid that so often education now kind of dismisses the Bible or just tucks it away in an RE lesson or something, as though it's just sort of something to be considered on the side. He wants it put back at the center of everything, because he says if you don't know the Bible, you don't understand the culture you're living in. And I think even Richard Dawkins was actually happy to fund on the 500th anniversary of the King James Version being he was happy to fund a campaign to put a copy of that into every school library, because even he recognizes the cultural value of the Bible. So I think there's no doubt that the Bible has had a huge influence and continues to have a huge influence. The real question, of course, that I want to say to Richard Dawkins again is, and he's played that character for several decades, and he's played that character for several decades, and but what not that many people know about David Suchet is he's a very committed Christian, and he's got a really interesting story of adult conversion. So he was in a bath in a hotel, believe it or not, filming a film in the mid-'80s, when he suddenly had this kind of moment of realization where he had always had this tradition of talking to his grandfather as though he existed, even though he was sort of long dead. And he said, well, if I believe I can sort of talk to my grandfather, I suppose that raises the whole question of whether there's life after death. And, well, if I'm going to think about that, maybe I should go and read the Bible. And he ended up reading the book of Romans. And he said that just encountering the book of Romans changed his life. He encountered this way of living and being in the world that totally transformed his thinking and led him to the Gospels, to Jesus. And he was baptized soon after. It's just one little example of the way in which an encounter with the Bible can change someone's life. And I find more and more people, a bit like David Suchet, suddenly realizing this isn't just a book of ancient wisdom, it's actually a book about a real person who kind of has a call on our life now.
And he's done the audio Bible.
He has,
which
yeah.
I've got on my iPhone. If you haven't got that, I recommend it. It's not a few pounds.
And it's lovely to listen to it when David Suchet reads the Bible. It's great.
Beautifully read. I'd love to know. Do you know how long that took him to record?
I don't know. He probably did tell me, but I can imagine it's a months long kind of endeavour to record the whole thing.
Let's just briefly talk about the Bible as a historical source, because we obviously are Christians, see it as a religious text. That's how it was introduced to me as a child. But it is an important, reliable historical source, not just for Christians and believers, but generally.
Yeah,
not.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember interviewing a friend of mine called James Orr. We were at university together, but we didn't really know each other. But he was a classicist at the time, and he came to university not as a Christian. But the thing that started to change his mind was when someone gave him a copy of the New Testament in its original Greek. And because he could read Greek, ancient Greek, he could just start reading the Gospel of Mark. And it kind of blew his mind, because he had always thought, as you say, of the Bible as just something that lives in a kind of religious silo. But when he started reading it, he thought, well, this is telling me a history that's just as historical on the face of it as all of the other histories from ancient Greek and Rome that I read. And he suddenly kind of realized this isn't just a religious text. This is a historical document, and it's making claims about a person called Jesus Christ. And that was a journey that just kind of suddenly switching to seeing this as a historical thing set him on a journey to Christian faith. And what's interesting about the Bible, and on the slide there, it says genre and manuscript evidence, is that just as a historical document, it is one of the best attested documents of the ancient world.
Put the next slide up, because this is the table we've...
Yeah, so this is just putting side by side the Bible with the New Testament specifically with other ancient works, Homer's Iliad, Aristotle's writings, Caesar's Gallic Wars. And the point that you can see in those columns is when they were first composed, and then when we have our earliest manuscripts, the kind of the earliest existing manuscripts that kind of we have from that still exist, if you like, and how long elapsed between the writing, the kind of setting down of those events from the time that they're describing, and then the number of manuscripts we have. And as you'll see in every case, the Bible is far closer to the time of the events in question. We have far earlier manuscripts, and we have far more manuscripts. And this is like, it's better than any other ancient historical documents, bar none. There are no competitors with, and it gets technical, but there are various reasons why the number of manuscripts in particular makes a huge difference to being able to piece together what was are actually on those original documents. And so we know with 99% accuracy that we've got the original words that were first written down.
More evidence for Jesus than Julius Caesar, isn't there?
That's a commonly said thing. But the remarkable thing about that is that for most people of the ancient world, we only really know about the Julius Caesars because they had their image on a coin that we can still dig up, or on a statue that we can still uncover. People like Jesus, they never stuck around in historical memory because they were nobodies. Jesus was just this backwater, Galilean preacher. And yet we have 4 biographies written of him soon after the time that he lived. That's almost unheard of in that day and age.
And just to explain, there's a point about the names in the gospel I thought was fascinating. I hadn't heard before. But for example, blind Bartimaeus and things like that. What's that point being made?
This is just fascinating research. This is quite recent research. But a lot of people have this idea in their head that the Gospels, the stories of Jesus, were written down a long time after the events at some other place, okay? So they've only got a kind of tangential amount of sort of real... But what a scholar called Richard Borkham has done is he took actual records, research that was done into the names of people living at the time of Jesus. This was from burial records, basically. And he cross-referenced that with the number of times those names appear in the New Testament. And what he found was an incredible coherence between those two things. The names that were most popular at this very specific time, in that very specific place, come up in exactly the same frequency in the Gospels. What that tells you is this wasn't being written down at a different place and time. It was being written down by people who were there, who knew the names of people. And there's all kinds of other research gone into it. But the point is, it's a historical kind of, it lends huge historical credibility to the fact that this wasn't just sort of second-hand, third-hand, fourth-hand kind of later on, which is what a lot of the scholarship has assumed in the past. But people like Richard Borkham have been showing that this is actually the work of eyewitnesses, and it was faithfully passed on. And there's all kinds of other ways in which that comes through in the research.
And the other one, undesigned coincidences. Tell us
So
about
very
what that
briefly,
means.
undesigned coincidences is the idea that when you look at the Gospels themselves, there are lots of things that you can pick out one story here and a detail of another story there, and they make sense of each other. And these are coincidences that are undesigned. They weren't kind of planted there to kind of make a proof. But later on, we can come and look at it and realize, there's definitely a historical core here to this story, because these things all tend to tally up. So one quick example is the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. This happens in a region which is near to Bethsaida. And in the story, rather than asking Peter or one of the kind of more major disciples to this question about where are we going to find food for all these people, he asked Philip. And it's just a detail that's in the story. But it makes perfect sense if you go to earlier on in the gospel and in another gospel where we're told that Philip comes from that region. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, it makes perfect sense that he's asking Philip, because we find out from elsewhere. And these are just like little details which, when you put them together, kind of interlock to show these aren't just kind of stories that were made up. And they were actually independent people who knew the people. And when you look at the details that interlock, it makes this very strong case that actually it's coming from somewhere. There's a real historical credibility.
It's a bit like if two eyewitnesses saw a bank robbery, and one says, I saw the person run out, the perpetrator, and they had a black beard and a tattoo on the side of their face, and the other one said, well, I saw them limping, or two separate accounts. And then you find the culprit, and you find they've got both of those characteristics. What you have is this thing that the two people saw something real. They can't have imagined that, because that's too much. It's too deep.
Yeah, or another example that Lydia McGrew, who's done a whole book on this, gives. She says, imagine, two people describing the scene of a crime, and one says, I saw the person fall over, and another person doesn't mention them falling over, but says, oh, I saw they had their shoe untied. And those two details make sense of each other. They corroborate each other. Yeah. And there's all kinds of examples of that happening basically in the Bible, where things that the different writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, whoever, couldn't have kind of known from each other, but where the details end up supporting each other's version of events, basically.
Yeah. And then there's places and archaeology.
Yeah, this is just another fascinating example where you just get the sense that the gospel authors know the territory they're describing. Again, if you read later versions of the Gospels, sometimes there are these things called the Gnostic Gospels or apocryphal Gospels, which are written at a much further remove in a different place. They're very general. They don't have any detail, really. The stories they tell don't kind of really map onto real history and places. What you find the Gospels are full of, though, is people who lived at the time, talking about Caesar, talking about Augustus, talking about Pilate, and they're talking about places, and in very specific ways, that you go down from Jerusalem to Jericho. You have to be a local to know that that's the way the land lies, basically. And lots of these details all come together to show that, again, these weren't stories that were kind of made up at some later stage, because they didn't have Wikipedia or Google or encyclopedias. If you didn't live there at the time, you wouldn't know that this is the way the land works, and yet it's reflected brilliantly in the Gospels. And then the fact that we have got amazing excavations continuing today, where every time we basically dig up Israel, we discover more things that authenticate the stories in the Gospels. This is a pool that was discovered, the pool of Siloam, which is mentioned in John's Gospel and is the place where this healing takes place of the blind man. But skeptics often assumed it just didn't exist. It was just kind of fabricated by John because there was no evidence of this pool until, I'm trying to remember which year it was, but in the 2000s, excavation works uncovered a pool which exactly matches the description in John's Gospel, down to the porticos in it and everything, and has coins dating from exactly before and after the time of Jesus. So time, place, details, it's all there. And suddenly everyone's like, oh, I guess the story is true then. And it's incredible the way that these physical excavations are confirming it.
And we must touch finally on the centerpiece of Christian faith, which is the resurrection. And many writers, lawyers, have come to the conclusion that the evidence for the resurrection is strong, overwhelming. I mean, just talk us through. You deal with this on the podcast, but just talk us through that. So
again, it's one of these areas where a lot of people, have just assumed believing in the resurrection is just a quote unquote matter of faith, a bit like the person you referenced earlier who says we just take these things on faith. But actually, faith is not believing something in the absence of the evidence. It's kind of trusting in something based on the fact we do have good reasons to believe in it. And the resurrection is one of those things. So very briefly, there are four key things I'll give you just today, reasons why it makes sense. Basically, there are what have come to become the minimal facts. These are facts about this era that are agreed on by the majority of historians, whether they're believing or non-believing. Yeah. So this isn't just Christian historians saying, oh, we think that there was a resurrection. It's the fact that these are the generally agreed upon facts that are agreed upon whether these are Christian or non-Christian historians. The first is that Jesus died by crucifixion. That is just an absolutely accepted fact of the ancient world. It's one of the best attested events in the ancient world.
And no serious historian believes that Jesus was a myth.
Oh, yeah. So that is very much just a internet invention, basically. Yeah. Jesus mythicism purely gets its oxygen from the internet. No serious historian would for a minute take that seriously. Even like a historian like Bart Ehrman, who's very critical of the New Testament, he wrote a whole book against Jesus mythicism because it's such a ridiculous idea. So anyway, Jesus died by crucifixion. Why is that important? Well, you have to have a dead man in order to have a resurrection, okay? It is important to establish that Jesus lived and died by Roman crucifixion. And as I say, the vast majority of historians, there's absolutely no disagreement on that. Number two, the tomb was found empty by his women followers. This is an interesting one because, again, there's a large degree of agreement among both Christian and non-Christian historians that an empty tomb was discovered, specifically by women followers. Now, that's obviously what we're told in the Gospels. What's interesting is the reason the historians take that as being a really credible story is because the testimony of women was worth far less than that of a man in that day and age. And so it's what's called the criterion of embarrassment. It was a kind of an embarrassing fact at the time. But now, in more enlightened times, if you like, when we don't have those kinds of biases against women, it counts as a huge plus in its favour. The fact that they reported that, even though if they were wanting to pull the wool over their eyes, they would have made men the first discoverers of the empty tomb. That would have been the normal thing to do. But they put women at the tomb because that was who did discover the empty tomb. And now it counts as in its favour that this is a credible story. So there's a large degree of agreement among scholars, again, that the empty tomb was found by a group of female followers. Yeah. Okay, third minimal fact agreed upon by the vast majority of scholars is it the conversion next one? Groups and individuals report meeting the risen Jesus. So again, lots of stories in the Gospels of people who claim to have met the risen Jesus. And again, even non-Christian scholars like Gerd Ludemann have said it may be taken as a historical fact that the followers of Jesus had experiences that they believed were of the risen Jesus. Now, the question is, was it the risen Jesus? What the historians are, all the historians are, say, the majority of historians are willing to say is they certainly had experiences they believed were of the risen Jesus.
Well, you put a quote on the slide of 1 Corinthians. I've always thought this is one of the most compelling, tiny forensic point. But just explain
So this is
point here.
just really important. 1 Corinthians 15 is this is Paul kind of passing on, as he says, what he'd already received. This is a tradition about the burial and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, what's really important about this is that Paul's writing 1 Corinthians probably about 20 or 30 years after the events, around 50 sort of AD maybe. But what he's quoting is a much earlier creed that he's been given, okay? And scholars date this creed about Christ's resurrection and the various witnesses to the resurrection to within possibly even months of the events themselves. Now, that's like historical gold for a historian. What it says is that this belief in the resurrection of Jesus was not some later hazy, game of telephone. It kind of changed over time and this legend grew up that Jesus... It was there from the very beginning of the Christian movement. And we know that from 1 Corinthians 15 and what it tells us. And of course, Paul himself is absolutely adamant that without the resurrection, our faith is in vain. So it's absolutely central.
And the point that's been made to me is that line where he says, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive. What he's doing is saying to the readers of this, if you don't believe me,
go and check.
You can go and ask
yeah,
them.
Exactly.
And that
that's
has the real ring of truth
and
to
that's
it.
the big difference generally between Christianity and all other religions. All other religions their beliefs tend to be given in a kind of personal, private angelic visitation. You get that in Islam with the Quran. You get that in Mormonism, Joseph Smith and these plates. Christianity is very explicit that these are testable public events. You could go and ask the people, and you could sit, and that's the whole point. So basically, the historians take this very seriously, that there were people who claimed that they had met the risen Jesus. The fourth point is that the early church experienced explosive growth. We know this. We know that there was this massive growth, and that these were people who were willing to be flogged, imprisoned, tortured, killed for their faith, their belief that Jesus had risen from the dead. It went against all their Jewish expectations as well. That's a really important point to make, is that they were not expecting Jesus to rise from the dead. Jewish people at the time had a belief in a general resurrection at the end of time, but they had no expectation that people would rise now, least of all someone they believed was the Messiah, who had been crucified on a Roman cross. That was against all their expectations, and then rising again. And yet, this was exactly what they went around proclaiming. So again, where did they get this strange belief from if it hadn't actually happened?
And they proclaimed it in spite of the fact it might cost them their life.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's, people don't tend to die for something they know isn't actually true. And so you've got these four facts, okay, and none of them individually kind of give you an absolutely kind of overwhelming case for the resurrection. But I think when you take them together, I think you've got all of the ingredients for saying, well, look, there's a resurrection-shaped hole at the center of this. Now, you could try and come up with other explanations for it, kind of natural explanations, and people have offered lots, like maybe they imagined it, maybe it was a legend, maybe it was hallucinations. None of them, I think, actually make sense of this evidence. I think this helps us to ask, well, we just have to be open to the idea, maybe they were telling the truth. Maybe what they claimed actually had happened. And I think this kind of evidence is still convincing people today. I met a woman called Molly Worthen just recently who said she's a professor of history of religion at University of North Carolina, a journalist, and it was when one of her interview subjects challenged her to get off the agnostic fence and said, have you ever actually looked into the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus? He gave her some homework. She went away, and a year later she got baptized because she had come to the view that I can't explain everything in the Bible, but all I can say is something happened in the first century, and I think there's enough evidence there for me to put my trust in Jesus. So it still happens. Yeah.
Was it Douglas Murray who visited Galilee and said, something happened here?
So I had an interview again a few years ago with Douglas Murray, and again, he's one of these Christ-haunted individuals. I think he's attracted to Christianity in some ways, but he struggles with the metaphysics and the historical claims. But he did say on his last visit to Israel at the time, he said, especially when he walked through Galilee, he said something happened here that he couldn't deny. Who knows where that'll end up for him? But all I know is that there are some people for whom they've looked at the history, and they found it a compelling case.
Justin, thank you very much for your time. Let's show our appreciation for. Justin's going to hang around afterwards, so if you want to ask him any questions or get him to sign a book, he'll be away.
Happy
But
to
other
do
than
so.
that, thank you very much for your time. Thank you all for coming. The weekend events continue. We've got a celebration service this evening, Sunday morning worship tomorrow morning, tomorrow evening as well, and then Monday evening. Leadership event as well on Monday morning. So hope to see you at as many of those events as you can make. Thank you very much.
Thank you.